Hello, welcome back to another Project 45 video looking at the events and successes of the First Crusade, from Call to Conquest 1096 to 1099. For a quick recap, let's look over what we did last lesson. We looked at many things, but perhaps most pertinently, we addressed the Council of Piacenza and Byzantine crisis and Pope Urban II at the Council of Clermont. The causes are as follows. Cause 1, religious motivation, the promise of salvation, preserving the pilgrimage routes, and the liberation of the Holy Land, Jerusalem, for Christians. Cause 2, political and strategic, the papacy's desire to assert leadership and aid Byzantium and Alexios, and in order for nobles to gain land and prestige. And lastly, cause 3, social and economic, younger sons and knights were seeking wealth, and Muslim weakness was something to capitalize on. So the journey begins. The People's Crusade set up much earlier than the main contingent, the Prince's Crusade, and was led by Peter the Hermit, and consisted mainly of peasants. It was crushed earlier than the Prince's Crusade as well by Kilij Arslan, the Sultan of Rum. Meanwhile, the Prince's Crusade set out later. It consisted of Raymond of Toulouse, Godfrey of Bouillon, Bohemond of Taranto, Bishop of Adhemar, the papal legate, and it set out in August 1096. Of course, there were other princes involved, and I highly suggest looking at the character profile from last lesson. Moreover, all of these leaders coordinated, but they led independently. So at this point, the Crusaders have walked an incredibly long way, from anywhere in Europe to Jerusalem, and I highly recommend looking at a map and seeing just how difficult that trek might have been, especially because most of them were walking. On that journey, a lot of the rank and file ended up dying because of things like starvation or pure exhaustion. The journey took quite some time, hence why they arrived in May 1097. But eventually, they reached Nicaea, the capital of the Sultanate of Rum and a stronghold in the Seljuk Empire. We've introduced Sultan Kilij Arslan, but just to remind you, he is the Sultan of Rum, and during this campaign when they arrived, he was absent because he was fighting against the Danishmends. Many believe that Kilij Arslan underestimated the new wave of the Crusaders as he had crushed the People's Crusade earlier. His absence meant that the Crusaders could quickly encircle the city and use siege tactics to effectively bombard them. Moreover, a Byzantine naval blockade helped cut off Nicaea from any trade supply routes. All in all, the Siege of Nicaea ends up being a great morale boost and success for the Crusaders. The Crusaders move forward until they reach the city of Dorylaeum. The Battle of Dorylaeum ensues when Bohemond's smaller force was ambushed by a larger Seljuk force. Severely outnumbered and barraged by Turkish archers, Bohemond managed to use tactics to protect unarmored soldiers. It's key to note that the Turkish defense was a lot more agile in terms of their horses and mobility in comparison to the Crusaders, who weren't able to move as much, especially due to their heavy armor and midsummer heat. He was able to overcome the hours of brutal attacks, and did this whilst coordinating an army that didn't even speak the same language as him. The Crusaders were incurring heavy losses, but a second larger Crusader force led by Godfrey and Raymond arrived and outflanked Arslan. So once again, despite significant losses, Dorylaeum was a crucial strategic victory for Crusaders, bolstering their morale once more. The Crusaders move onwards to Antioch. Now it's debated whether they actually needed to attack Antioch en route to Jerusalem, however they ultimately decided to do so. There was much back and forth, but Bohemond ultimately decided that he would lead it as long as he was able to keep Antioch afterwards. And so the Crusaders began besieging Antioch in October 1097, facing starvation, disease, and harsh conditions all around. As part of his possible ulterior motive to set up an area in Antioch for himself, Bohemond secretly negotiated with Firuz, a tower guard, to betray the city. On 3 June 1098, the Crusaders scaled the wall and took Antioch. It's also important to note that Antioch was incredibly difficult to besiege. It had formidable walls and also geographically was incredibly difficult to get through. However, days later, the Crusaders were trapped inside by a large Muslim relief army they were partially aware of arriving, led by Kerboga of Mosul. The Crusaders had now turned from those who were sieging to becoming the besieged. Although Muslim disunity, especially between Kerboga, Ridwan, and Dukak from the respective cities of Mosul and Damascus, weakened the siege effort. The Crusaders were in an incredibly difficult and tight position. However, almost like the stroke of luck, morale was restored when Peter Bartholomew claimed to find the Holy Lance, seen as a divine sign from God. For context, the Holy Lance is supposedly the spear that pierced Jesus on his crucifixion. With this newfound morale, on June 28th, the Crusaders launched a surprise attack and defeated Kerboga, whose allies deserted him mid-battle. This desertion stems deeply from the fact that there was Muslim disunity in the ranks. And once more, the Crusaders are able to rise above their issues and defeat Antioch, creating a key stronghold. However, taking Antioch was actually not part of the plan, and so that strained relationships between the Byzantines. And finally, the main contingent Crusader force reached where they were planning to go to all along, Jerusalem. After months of marching south, the Crusaders finally reached Jerusalem in June 1099, controlled by the Fatimid Caliphate at this point. Weakened by hunger, heat, and low supplies, they began building siege towers using wood from dismantled ships at Jaffa. Jerusalem was a strongly fortified city, however it had been passed hands multiple times at this point, so defenses were weakened more than usual. The Fatimid defenders held out initially, but that didn't last very long. On 15th July, the Crusaders launched a two-pronged assault led by Godfrey and Raymond. Godfrey's men broke through the northern walls using a mobile siege tower, allowing the Crusaders to flood into the city. And once inside, the Crusaders ruthlessly massacred thousands of Muslims and Jewish inhabitants, an act that shocked even contemporaries. The capture of Jerusalem marked the climax of the First Crusade. Whilst Godfrey was named Defender of the Holy Sepulchre, he refused the title of king as he didn't want to take that title where Jesus wore the crown of thorns. It ultimately proved to be a crushing defeat for the Fatimid Caliphate, as Jerusalem had now fallen in the hands of the Christians. This was a victory of massive symbolic importance. However, tensions remained over leadership, and the brutality of the siege damaged long-term Muslim-Christian relations. As a result of the Crusaders' victories, they were able to establish states within the region that they had hoped for. In chronological order, the county of Edessa was set up in 1098 by Baldwin. This was soon followed by the founding of the Principality of Antioch, led by Bohemond in 1098, and the Kingdom of Jerusalem in 1099 by Godfrey. The county of Tripoli was set up a little later by Bertrand of Toulouse, who was related to Raymond of Toulouse, but this isn't really necessary nor talked about in this course. But it almost seems comical how the Crusaders were able to go through this all. It was an incredibly difficult task to get to Jerusalem, with many of the people dying. So how were the 8 Crusaders able to be so successful? And why? Well, one of the most important reasons was Muslim disunity. The Muslim world was politically fragmented, and the rivalries between the key leaders like Kerboga Ridwan of Aleppo and Dukak of Damascus meant they failed to unite against the Crusaders. This lack of coordination weakened their resistance, and hence they weren't able to prove a palpable force against the Crusaders. Moreover, Crusader leadership and tactics. Commanders like Bohemond, Godfrey, and Raymond used flexible tactics and siege strategies, like we've seen beforehand, often adapting to unfamiliar terrain. Bohemond's cunning at Antioch and Godfrey's use of siege towers at Jerusalem were crucial military successes. And lastly, sheer religious zeal and motivation. We tend to be quite cynical of that in this modern-day interpretation. However, back then, it must have been a key part as to why they were able to continue pushing onwards despite all their setbacks. The Crusaders were driven by deep spiritual conviction and the promise of salvation, and believed that this cause was divinely sanctioned or ordained by God. Visions like the Holy Land's discovery by Peter Bartholomew at Antioch, or just other massive strokes of luck, helped boost morale, helping them persevere through starvation, disease, and long sieges. Now, before this lesson comes to a close, let's look at the perspectives on the First Crusade. That's an important IB skill for alternative perspectives and sometimes writing 15 markers, but it's also important to assess different factors. Anna Komnena, the daughter of the Byzantine Emperor Alexius Komnenos during the First Crusade, wrote the Alexiad. She has invaluable Byzantine insight into this, and she viewed the Crusaders as unreliable and power-hungry, and criticizes them. She also criticized Bohemond's actions, but she had a particular infatuation for him. Ibn al-Athir was a Muslim chronicler, and he blames Muslim disunity for defeat and condemns the brutality of the Crusaders, especially at Jerusalem. Modern historian Thomas Asbridge highlights mixed motives: religious faith, ambition, and survival, often a balanced interpretation that allows you to contrast the other ones. Meanwhile, another modern historian, Dan Jones, highlights the brutality and fanaticism of the First Crusade, stressing the chaotic violence of the Crusades as a whole and the Crusaders. Now, before we leave, I'd highly recommend checking out Extra History's First Crusade series, offering a brief overview of the entire campaign. Kings and Generals also offers a more in-depth detail, perhaps more than necessary for this course, so finding a balance between this and picking out key examples is important for exam questions. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope this video helped.